Picture this. It's 1876, and America is 100 years old. The Civil War is over, the Union is saved, and the nation is drunk on possibility. But here's the thing, and this is what gets me about this whole story. While Americans are celebrating their centennial, planning their grand exhibitions, and patting themselves on the back for surviving their adolescent crisis, they're about to stumble into something that will shake them to their core, because out there, beyond the edge of their mapped world, in a land they think of as empty wilderness waiting to be filled, ancient nations are living lives that follow rhythms older than Rome, the Lakota people. And when I say Lakota, I'm talking about what white folks called the Sioux, though that was actually an enemy tribe's word for them. These people knew every stream, every hill, every sacred place across a territory larger than Texas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let me take you back to that world. Imagine you're standing on the Great Plains in 1868. No roads, no towns, no fences. Just an ocean of grass stretching to every horizon, and moving across it like living islands are the buffalo herds. 60 million of them. 60 million. Think about that number for a second. The entire population of the United States today could each have their own buffalo, and there'd still be 20 million left over. And following those herds, living with them, are the Plains tribes. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. Their entire civilization flows with the buffalo. They eat buffalo, wear buffalo, live in buffalo hide lodges, use buffalo chips for fuel. When the herds move, they move. When the buffalo rest, they rest. It's not just a way of life. It's the way of life, perfected over centuries. But here's what's happening at the same time. Railroad crews are hammering spikes into ties, pushing iron rails across that same grass ocean. Telegraph wires are following the rails. And behind the wires come the towns, the settlers, the soldiers. Two completely different ways of understanding the world are about to collide, and neither side really comprehends what the other represents. The white Americans see empty land that needs to be filled, resources that need to be extracted, a continent that needs to be connected from sea to shining sea. It's not that they're necessarily evil, though some certainly are. It's that they literally cannot conceive of a valid way of life that doesn't involve farming, mining, building, improving, progressing. Land that isn't being used, and by used, they mean plowed or built on or fenced, is being wasted. The Plains tribes see the earth as alive, as sacred as their mother. You don't improve your mother. You don't sell pieces of your mother. You don't fence your mother or plow her up. The very concept makes no sense. When white negotiators ask to buy the land, it's like asking to buy the wind or purchase the rain. How do you sell something that belongs to everyone and no one? Now, the government in Washington thinks it has found a solution to this problem. Treaties, pieces of paper with words on them that will somehow make everything work out. And the biggest, most important of these treaties gets signed at Fort Laramie in 1868. Picture this scene. It's April 29th, 1868. Inside a rough wooden building at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, government commissioners in their finest clothes sit across a table from Lakota chiefs in eagle feathers and beaded shirts. The commissioners have stacks of papers covered in English words. The chiefs have interpreters who are doing their best to explain concepts that don't translate. The treaty they're signing, and this is crucial to understand, creates the Great Sioux Reservation, which includes all of present-day South Dakota, west of the Missouri River. All of it. But that's not all. The treaty also recognizes something called unceded territory, land where the Lakota can hunt as long as the buffalo may range, and where white people are forbidden to enter. This unceded territory includes most of Wyoming, most of Montana, and parts of North Dakota and Nebraska. Red Cloud signs this treaty. Red Cloud, who just spent 2 years fighting the United States Army to a standstill, who forced them to abandon 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail, who won what historians call the only successful war ever fought by Native Americans against the United States government. He signs because he believes he's won. He believes the treaty means what it says. But here's the problem, and this is where the tragedy really begins. The government officials signing that treaty know that white Americans will never, ever respect those boundaries. They're signing a piece of paper they have no intention of honoring, buying time while they figure out how to get around their own promises. And the Lakota chiefs? Some of them understand exactly what's happening. Sitting Bull doesn't even show up at Fort Laramie. He's out there in the unceded territory with his band, watching all of this from a distance. And he's thinking what you're probably thinking right now. This won't end well. Sitting Bull, Tatanka Iotanka in Lakota, is about 37 years old in 1868, in his absolute prime as a war leader and holy man. He's built like a bull, thick and powerful, with scars covering his body from Sundance rituals and combat wounds. He's fought in more than 60 battles against enemy tribes and white soldiers. He's a man who talks to spirits and sees the future in visions. And everything he sees tells him that making deals with the whites is like making deals with the wind, pointless. While Red Cloud is negotiating at Fort Laramie, Sitting Bull is living the old way in the Powder River country, following the buffalo, raiding enemy tribes, conducting the ceremonies that keep his people connected to the sacred powers. He looks at the treaty signers the way you might look at someone selling their children. How do you make a deal about your mother? How do you promise to stay in one place when your life is movement? How do you trust people who have broken every promise they've ever made? And here's what makes this whole situation so explosive. It works at first. For about 6 years after the Fort Laramie Treaty, there's an uneasy peace. The treaty chiefs live on the reservation, getting government rations. The traditional chiefs like Sitting Bull live in the unceded territory, hunting buffalo and avoiding white contact. It's an unstable arrangement, sure, but it's holding together until the summer of 1874, when everything changes. That's when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, we'll get to know him very well, leads an expedition into the Black Hills to establish a military post. The Black Hills, which the Lakota call Pahasapa, the heart of everything holy. The hills are specifically protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty. No whites are supposed to enter them, ever. But Custer goes in anyway with over 1,000 men, soldiers, scientists, miners, newspaper reporters. It's disguised as a military reconnaissance, but everyone knows what they're really looking for. And on July 30th, 1874, they find it gold, not just traces of gold, not just promising signs. Gold from the roots of grass down, as one of Custer's miners puts it. Gold lying in stream beds like yellow pebbles. Gold enough to make every man in the expedition rich. And here's the thing about gold rushes. They're like avalanches. Once they start, you can't stop them. Within weeks of the news reaching the east, thousands of prospectors are heading for the Black Hills. The government makes half-hearted attempts to stop them, sending cavalry patrols to turn back the gold seekers. But it's hopeless. You might as well try to stop a river with your bare hands. The Lakota watch this invasion with growing fury and desperation. These aren't just any mountains being violated. The Black Hills are where their ancestors are buried, where young men go on vision quests, where the spirits live. Asking them to sell the Black Hills is like asking Christians to sell heaven. Sitting Bull speaks for all the traditional Lakota when he tells government negotiators, "I want you to go and tell the Great Father that I do not want to sell any land to the government. Not some land. Any land. Because once you start selling pieces of your mother, where do you stop?" But the pressure keeps building. The gold is real. The prospectors keep coming, and the government is tired of pretending to enforce a treaty it never wanted to honor. Through 1875, commission after commission arrives at the agencies, trying to buy the Black Hills, offering millions of dollars for land that has no price. The final commission arrives in September 1875. They want to buy not just the Black Hills, but all the unceded territory, essentially everything the Lakota have left. The meeting takes place at the Red Cloud Agency, and thousands of Lakota gather to hear what the whites are offering. When the commissioners explain their proposal, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Chiefs rise one after another to refuse. "The Black Hills country is my country and I love it," says Little Wound. "If you take it, I will have nothing left that is worth anything." Red Cloud himself, the great negotiator, the man who signed the treaty, stands up and speaks the words that seal his people's fate. "The Black Hills is the house of gold for our Indians. We watch it to get rich. The commission fails completely. The Lakota will not sell." But here's the crucial point. The government doesn't need them to sell anymore. Public opinion in the East has shifted. Americans want the gold, they want the land, and they're tired of Indian stubbornness. The failure of the Black Hills Commission gives Washington the excuse it's been looking for. On December 6th, 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sends a message to all agencies. Any Indians not living on designated reservations must report to the agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile and subject to military action. January 31st, in the middle of the worst winter anyone can remember, when the snow lies 3 feet deep and the temperature drops to 40 below zero, when traveling means death for families with children and old people. It's an impossible deadline, and everyone knows it. Sitting Bull receives this ultimatum through messengers who brave the winter storms to reach his camp. His response is immediate and predictable. He will not come in. He will not abandon the sacred places. He will not live on a reservation like a dog begging for scraps. If the whites want war, they can have war. But here's what the government officials in Washington don't understand, what they can't possibly understand, sitting in their heated offices looking at maps. They think they're dealing with scattered bands of hostiles who can be rounded up by a few cavalry regiments. They have no idea that their ultimatum is about to unite the Plains tribes in the largest gathering of Native American military power in history. Because as word spreads through the winter camps, something unprecedented begins to happen. Lakota bands that have been living on reservations start slipping away to join Sitting Bull. Cheyenne warriors leave their agencies. Arapaho fighters disappear from their assigned lands. They're not just answering Sitting Bull's call. They're answering the call of something deeper, older, more powerful than any government decree. They're answering the call of a people who refused to disappear. The winter of 1875 to 1876 becomes a time of preparation, of ceremony, of gathering strength for what everyone knows is coming. In the scattered camps across the Powder River country, warriors clean their weapons and check their horses. Holy men conduct rituals and seek visions of the future. Women begin making the extra moccasins and war shirts that will be needed for the great conflict ahead. And in Washington, military planners begin drawing up the campaign that will end the Indian problem once and for all. They're planning the largest coordinated military operation ever mounted against the Plains tribes. 3 separate armies will converge on the hostile camps from 3 directions, driving them like game animals into a killing box. What none of them realize, not the politicians in Washington, not the generals planning the campaign, not even Sitting Bull himself, is that they're about to create the conditions for the most shocking military defeat in American frontier history. They're about to give birth to a legend that will outlive them all. The stage is set. The players are moving into position, and somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of Montana Territory, a small river called the Little Bighorn is waiting to become the most famous battlefield in the American West. Now let me tell you about the man who's going to walk into this collision of worlds and become the most famous casualty in American military history, George Armstrong Custer. Just saying that name conjures up images, doesn't it? The flowing golden hair, the fringed buckskins, the last stand on a lonely hill. But here's what's fascinating about Custer. He wasn't born to be a frontier legend. He was born to be forgotten. December 5th, 1839, New Rumley, Ohio. A dirt-poor farming family welcomes their first son into a world that offers him exactly 0 advantages. No money, no connections, no obvious talents. His father, Emmanuel, is a blacksmith and part-time farmer who can barely keep food on the table. Young George, they call him. Audie grows up wearing hand-me-down clothes and dreaming of something bigger than shoeing horses and ploughing fields. But here's the thing about Custer that explains everything. That comes after. He's got something you can't teach and can't fake. Charisma. Raw, undeniable, magnetic personal presence. Even as a kid, other children follow him. When he talks, people listen. When he moves, people watch. It's like he's generating his own gravity field at West Point, and getting there is a story in itself, requiring political favors his family couldn't possibly afford. Custer proceeds to compile one of the worst academic records in the Academy's history. He graduates dead last in his class of 34 in 1861. Dead last. The kind of performance that should doom a military career before it starts, except the Civil War explodes just as he's graduating. And suddenly, the Union Army needs every officer it can get, even the ones who finished last at West Point. And here's where Custer's particular genius reveals itself. In peacetime, his reckless aggression would have gotten him court-martialed. In wartime, it gets him promoted. Picture this scene. It's July 3rd, 1863, the final day at Gettysburg. While Pickett's infantry is preparing for their doomed charge at Cemetery Ridge, Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart is trying to hit the Union rear. Standing in their way is a 23-year-old brigadier general, the youngest in the Union Army, with flowing yellow hair and a voice that can be heard over cannon fire. That's Custer at East Cavalry Field, leading the 1st Michigan Cavalry in a saber charge that smashes Stuart's attack and helps save the Union. "Come on, you Wolverines," he shouts, spurring his horse forward into the Confederate line. His men follow him because they can't help themselves. When Custer charges, you charge with him or you feel like a coward for the rest of your life. By the end of the war, this dead-last West Point graduate has become the most famous cavalry officer in America. He's led more successful cavalry charges than any other Union commander. He's been in the room when Lee surrenders at Appomattox. He's 25 years old, a major general, and he's tasted glory like a drug. But then the war ends. And here's Custer's tragedy in a nutshell. Peace bores him to death. The army shrinks from over 2 million men to 25,000. Most Civil War generals go back to civilian life, write their memoirs, run for office. But Custer can't let go. He accepts a reduction in rank to lieutenant colonel, a devastating blow to his ego, just to stay in uniform. Because being a small-town nobody again is worse than death. So when the 7th Cavalry gets posted to frontier duty in 1866, Custer sees opportunity where other officers see exile. The frontier means action. It means a chance for glory. It means newspaper correspondents who might write stories about dashing cavalry officers fighting savage Indians. And Custer has always understood that fame is a weapon as powerful as any saber. Now, while Custer is trying to rebuild his reputation on the frontier, let me tell you about the man he's destined to face. Sitting Bull isn't trying to become famous, he's trying to keep his people free. And that difference, that fundamental difference in motivation, is going to determine everything that happens next. Sitting Bull, Tatanka Iotanka, is born around 1831 in what's now South Dakota, into the Hunkpapa Lakota. His birth name is Jumping Badger, but he earns his adult name through a combination of bravery, spiritual power, and sheer stubborn determination that his people recognize as sacred. Where Custer is all flash and performance, Sitting Bull is substance and depth. He's a holy man who talks to spirits, a war leader who's never lost a battle, a chief who puts his people's welfare above his own glory. He's everything Custer wants to be but isn't, genuinely respected by those he leads. At 14, Sitting Bull counts his first coup against a Crow warrior. By 20, he's leading war parties. By 30, he's recognized as both a war chief and a medicine man, one of the few Lakota to hold both positions. This isn't accidental. His people see in him something they desperately need as the white world closes in around them. A leader who can fight both the physical battle and the spiritual one. But Sitting Bull's true genius isn't in warfare. It's in understanding what the whites represent. While other chiefs are negotiating, compromising, trying to find accommodation, Sitting Bull sees the fundamental truth. You can't negotiate with a flood. You can't compromise with a plague. The whites don't want coexistence. They want everything. So while Red Cloud is signing treaties at Fort Laramie, Sitting Bull is keeping his people free in the unceded territory, following the buffalo, maintaining the old ways. He's not fighting a military campaign. He's preserving a civilization. And then there's Crazy Horse. Now here's a figure who defies every stereotype about Plains Indian warriors. Crazy Horse, Tashunka Whitco, doesn't paint his face for battle, doesn't wear a war bonnet, doesn't scalp his enemies or torture prisoners. He rides into combat wearing only a simple breechcloth and moccasins, with a red hawk feather in his hair and sacred stones behind his ears. But when he fights, and this is what makes him legendary among his own people, bullets can't touch him. Arrows pass through him like he's made of smoke. Enemy warriors flee when they see him coming, because fighting Crazy Horse is like fighting a ghost, a spirit warrior who belongs more to the other world than this one. He's born around 1840 in the shadow of Bear Butte, a sacred mountain where Lakota holy men go to receive visions. His childhood name is Light Hair because of his unusually pale complexion and light brown hair, genetic gifts from a Minneconjou grandmother that make him stand out among the Oglala Lakota. At 17, he experiences the vision that shapes his entire life. While fasting on a hilltop seeking spiritual guidance, he sees a warrior on horseback emerging from a lake. The warrior wears no paint, carries only a lance and a few stones. Behind him rides his horse, and behind the horse walks his people. Bullets and arrows fly around the warrior, but none touch him. A voice tells Light Hair, "This is how you must dress for war." From that day forward, he becomes Crazy Horse, the name honoring a vision-receiving ancestor, and he fights exactly as the spirit showed him. Simple, direct, untouchable. In battle after battle against Crow, Pawnee, and white soldiers, he proves the vision true. He's never wounded in combat, never defeated. His people begin to believe he literally cannot be killed. While Sitting Bull provides the spiritual and political leadership for resistance, Crazy Horse becomes its sword. Where Sitting Bull is thoughtful and deliberate, Crazy Horse is pure instinct and action. Where Sitting Bull speaks in councils and conducts ceremonies, Crazy Horse speaks in war whoops and thundering hooves. But now let me tell you about two other men who are going to play crucial roles in our story. Though history mostly remembers them as footnotes to Custer's legend, Major Marcus Reno is 42 years old in 1876, a career officer who spent most of his adult life trying to live down a reputation for drinking and poor judgment. He's competent enough in peacetime, good with paperwork, reliable with routine duties, but combat brings out his worst instincts. Under pressure, Reno panics. Under fire, he freezes. And unfortunately for a lot of men in the 7th Cavalry, Marcus Reno is Custer's second-in-command. Then there's Captain Frederick Benteen, and this man is going to be crucial to understanding what happens at the Little Bighorn. Benteen is 51, a Civil War veteran with an outstanding combat record and an acid tongue that's made him enemies throughout the army. But his greatest enemy is his own commanding. Officer Benteen hates Custer with a passion that borders on pathological. He sees through all the posturing and publicity-seeking to the insecure glory hound underneath. Where other officers might grumble privately about Custer's grandstanding, Benteen makes his contempt public. He writes letters to newspapers criticizing Custer's tactics. He openly mocks Custer's appearance and mannerisms. The two men can barely be in the same room without tension crackling like electricity. This hatred isn't just personal, it's professional. Benteen is everything Custer isn't. Steady, reliable, more concerned with his men's welfare than his own reputation. His troops trust him because he's never asked them to die for his glory. When Benteen gives an order, it's because it needs to be done, not because it might look good in the newspapers. Now, you might wonder how these personalities, the glory-seeking Custer, the unreliable Reno, the bitter Benteen, end up commanding the same regiment? The answer tells you everything about the post-Civil War army. Good officers are leaving for better opportunities in civilian life. What's left are the men who can't or won't leave military service, the addicted to glory types like Custer, the functional alcoholics like Reno, and the bitter professionals like Benteen who have nowhere else to go. This is the officer corps that's supposed to pacify the Plains Indians. A regiment commanded by a man desperate for headlines, with a second in command who falls apart under pressure, and a senior captain who despises his superior officer. What could possibly go wrong? But here's what makes this story so fascinating. The Lakota and Cheyenne are facing their own leadership challenges. While Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse represent the traditional resistance, they're not the only voices in their communities. There are chiefs like Red Cloud who believe accommodation is the only path to survival. The white man made us many promises, more than I can remember, Red Cloud says, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it. But even knowing this, Red Cloud thinks fighting is hopeless. Better to take what you can get from the agency system than lose everything in a war you can't win. There are younger warriors who think even Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse aren't aggressive enough. Men like Gall, the Hunkpapa war chief, who's lost family members to white violence and wants blood for blood. These men see every compromise as betrayal, every negotiation as surrender. And there are the women, and this is something white observers consistently miss, the women who hold these communities together. Sitting Bull's mother, her holy door, who raised him to be a leader. Crazy Horse's wife, Black Shawl, who suffers from tuberculosis, caught from contact with white diseases. These women don't appear in the military dispatches or newspaper accounts, but they're the ones who preserve the culture, raise the children, make the decisions that keep families alive. As 1876 dawns, all these personalities are moving toward collision. Custer is chomping at the bit for a campaign that will restore his tarnished reputation. Sitting Bull is conducting the ceremonies that will unite the tribes for the greatest gathering in Plains Indian history. Crazy Horse is preparing for the war he's seen in his visions. Reno is drinking too much, and Benteen is sharpening his tongue for one last confrontation with his hated commander. But they're not just individuals anymore. They're representatives of two completely incompatible civilizations. Custer embodies everything white Americans believe about progress, individualism, and manifest destiny. Sitting Bull represents everything indigenous Americans value about community, spirituality, and living in harmony with the natural world. Crazy Horse is the perfect warrior for a people fighting for survival. Reno and Benteen are the flawed instruments of an empire that's overextended and overconfident. The winter camps are breaking up. The spring grass is growing. The buffalo herds are moving north into Montana territory, and following the buffalo in the greatest migration in Lakota history, thousands of people are gathering for what they sense will be the final confrontation. In Washington, generals are moving pins around maps, planning the campaign that will end Indian resistance forever. In the scattered camps along the Powder River, holy men are conducting ceremonies and seeking visions of what's coming. In barracks, from Fort Abraham Lincoln to Fort Ellis, soldiers are cleaning weapons and wondering if they'll see another Christmas. Everyone can feel it building, the pressure, the tension, the sense that something enormous is about to happen. Like a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon, you can see the lightning flickering in the distance, even though you can't hear the thunder yet. But the thunder is coming. And when it breaks over the little Bighorn Valley on June 25, 1876, it's going to shake both worlds to their foundations and create a legend that will outlive everyone who lived it. July 2nd, 1874. Dawn is breaking over the Black Hills of South Dakota, and the morning mist is rising from valleys that haven't seen a white man since the Fort Laramie Treaty declared them off-limits forever. But forever just ended, because winding through those sacred valleys is a column that stretches for 2 miles. Over 1,000 men, 100 wagons and a brass band playing Gary Owen. Leading this invasion is Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and he's in his element. This isn't just a military expedition. It's a traveling circus, a publicity stunt, a gold-hunting party disguised as a reconnaissance mission. Custer has brought along geologists, botanists, newspaper correspondents, photographers, and most tellingly, miners. Lots of miners. The official story is that they're establishing a military post to keep peace between the Lakota and their traditional enemies. But everyone knows what they're really doing. They're looking for gold. And the reason everyone knows this is because Custer can't keep his mouth shut about it. See, this is Custer at his most characteristic. He's supposed to be conducting a quiet military survey, but he's turned it into the biggest media event on the frontier. He's got correspondents from major eastern newspapers sending daily dispatches about the Custer expedition. He's having his photographer take pictures of him posing with dead grizzly bears. He's even brought along his own personal musician to serenade him around the campfire. But here's what Custer doesn't understand, what he can't possibly understand because his world doesn't include the concept. He's not just trespassing on Indian land. He's desecrating the most sacred place in the Lakota universe. The Black Hills, Pahasapa, are where the Lakota people came from in the beginning of time. According to their creation stories, the first humans emerged from a cave in these hills. This is where young men go on vision quests, where holy men seek guidance from the spirits, where the ancestors are buried. Asking the Lakota to sell the Black Hills is like asking Catholics to sell the Vatican, like asking Muslims to sell Mecca. But Custer sees wilderness that needs to be mapped, resources that need to be catalogued, and opportunities that need to be seized. On July 30th, 1874, those opportunities reveal themselves in a creek bed about 6 miles south of the present-day town of Custer. Horatio Ross, one of Custer's miners, is panning in French Creek when he finds it. Gold, not traces, not promising signs. Actual gold lying in the gravel like yellow pebbles. "I can get gold here right in the roots of the grass," Ross tells the expedition geologist. The news spreads through the camp like wildfire. Soon dozens of men are panning in French Creek, and they're all finding gold. Enough gold to make every one of them rich. Enough gold to trigger the biggest rush since California in 1849. Custer is beside himself with excitement. This isn't just a discovery, it's vindication. Proof that his expedition was justified, that his violation of the treaty was worth it, that George Armstrong Custer has once again shown superior judgment and leadership. He immediately dispatches Scout Charlie Reynolds with the news, sending him on a 100-mile ride through hostile territory to reach the nearest telegraph station. The message Reynolds carries is short and explosive. Gold has been found in several places, and it is the belief of those who are giving their attention to this subject that it will be found in paying quantities. Now think about what happens next. This is 1874, just 5 years after the Transcontinental Railroad connected the coasts, in an era when news travels at the speed of telegraph wires. Within days, newspapers across the country are running headlines about Custer's gold discovery. Within weeks, wagon trains are forming in frontier towns, loaded with prospectors, equipment, and dreams of instant wealth. The government tries to stop them. Sort of. Cavalry patrols are ordered to turn back gold seekers, and they do arrest some of the smaller parties. But it's like trying to stop a river with your bare hands. Every day, more prospectors slip through. Every week, new mining camps spring up in the hills. By the end of 1874, there are over 1,000 illegal miners in the Black Hills, and more coming every day. The Lakota watch this invasion with a mixture of rage and despair. These aren't just strangers trespassing on their land. These are grave robbers, vandals, men who are literally digging up their most sacred places looking for yellow metal. It's like watching your church being torn down for scrap lumber. Red Cloud, the great negotiator, the chief who signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, tries to work within the system. He travels to Washington in 1875 to meet with President Grant, to remind the government of its treaty obligations, to demand that the miners be removed from the Black Hills. Grant's response is a masterpiece of bureaucratic double talk. Of course, the government wants to honor its treaties. Of course, it will try to keep whites out of the Black Hills, but you have to understand, the American people want that gold, and this is a democracy. There's only so much any administration can do against the will of the people. What Grant doesn't say, but what everyone understands, is that removing the miners would require military force on a scale that would make the Civil War look like a border skirmish. How do you fight your own citizens to protect Indian rights? How do you explain to white voters that you're using their tax money to keep them away from gold that could make them rich? So instead, Grant does what politicians do when faced with an impossible situation. He appoints a commission to study the problem. The Black Hills Commission arrives at the Red Cloud Agency in September 1875, with instructions to buy the hills or lease mining rights from the Lakota. They're offering $6 million, an enormous sum by the standards of the day, for land that has no monetary value to its current owners. The commission is headed by Senator William Allison of Iowa, a smooth talker who's made his career finding middle ground between opposing sides. With him are congressmen, Indian agents and military officers, all convinced they can negotiate a solution that will satisfy everyone. They couldn't be more wrong. The meeting takes place in a natural amphitheater near the Red Cloud Agency, and it's a scene unlike anything in American diplomatic history. On one side sit the commissioners in their dark suits and top hats, sweating in the September heat, surrounded by their clerks and interpreters. On the other side are assembled over 7,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the largest gathering of Plains Indians anyone has ever seen. It's not just the numbers that are impressive, it's the sheer variety of leadership represented. Red Cloud is there, of course, the treaty chief trying to find some accommodation. But so is Spotted Tail, the Brule leader who's been pushing for compromise. And Little Big Man, the Oglala warrior who's never signed a treaty with anyone. And American Horse and Iron Hawk and dozens of other chiefs and headmen, each representing different bands, different viewpoints, different levels of willingness to deal with the whites. But the man everyone is watching, the man whose opinion will determine whether this negotiation succeeds or fails, isn't even there. Sitting Bull has refused to attend, sending word that he has nothing to say to men who want to buy his mother. Senator Allison opens the proceedings with a speech that would be comical if the stakes weren't so high. He talks about the great father in Washington who loves his red children and wants only what's best for them. He explains that white miners are already in the hills, that more are coming, and that the government can't stop them without risking civil war. Therefore, the wise course is to sell the hills to the government, which will use the money to benefit the Lakota people. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Chief after chief rises to reject the offer. "I will not sell the land where my people are buried," declares Red Dog. "The Black Hills is the house of gold for our Indians," says Red Cloud himself. "We watch it to get rich." But the most powerful response comes from Little Big Man, who leaps to his feet with a Winchester rifle in his hands and shouts words that echo across the plains. "I will kill the first chief who speaks for selling the Black Hills." The commissioners are shocked. This isn't how negotiations are supposed to work. Where's the horse trading, the compromise, the gradual wearing down of resistance? Instead, they're facing absolute, uncompromising refusal, backed by the threat of violence. They try different approaches. What about leasing mining rights instead of selling? No. What about selling just the portion of the hills where gold has been found? No. What about a larger payment? $10 million, $20 million. Still Numdot young man afraid of his horses, and yes, that's really his name. Though it means his horses are so fierce that enemies fear them, speaks for the younger generation. The white man is in the Black Hills already. He is there without our permission. That is not right. The commission tries for weeks to find someone, anyone, willing to make a deal. They're offering enough money to make every Lakota family wealthy by white standards. They're promising schools, hospitals, agricultural equipment, everything needed to transform the Plains tribes into settled farmers. All they want in return is a few thousand square miles of mountains that the Indians aren't even using for anything practical. But that's exactly the point the commissioners can't grasp. The Lakota aren't rejecting their offer because it's too small. They're rejecting it because the entire concept is meaningless. You can't sell the sacred. You can't put a price on the foundation of your existence. You can't trade your connection to the spirit world for money. No matter how much money it is, the commission finally gives up in October, returning to Washington with a report that essentially says the Indians won't sell, they won't lease, and they won't compromise. The Black Hills cannot be acquired through negotiation. This report lands on the desk of President Grant just as the 1876 election campaign is heating up. Grant's Republican Party is already facing corruption scandals and economic problems. The last thing they need is a protracted Indian war that will cost millions of dollars and potentially hundreds of American lives. But doing nothing isn't an option either. Every day, more miners pour into the Black Hills. Every week, there are new confrontations between whites and Indians. Every month, the pressure builds for the government to do something, anything, to resolve the crisis. In November 1875, Grant calls a secret meeting at the White House. Present are the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Interior, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and Generals Sheridan and Sherman, the men who won the Civil War and now run the U.S. Army. What happens in that meeting is never officially recorded, but the results speak for themselves. Within days, the Army stops trying to keep miners out of the Black Hills. Cavalry patrols that had been turning back prospectors are quietly reassigned to other duties. The message is clear without being stated. If the Lakota won't sell the Black Hills, the government will simply stop protecting their treaty rights. But that's still not enough to satisfy the gold rush mentality that's gripping the country. Americans want more than just access to the hills. They want the Indian problem solved permanently. They want the Plains tribes pacified, settled on reservations, transformed into farmers and Christians. They want the buffalo herds eliminated so the land can be used for cattle ranching and farming. Most of all, they want the hostile bands, Sitting Bull's people, Crazy Horse's warriors, all the Indians who refuse to live on reservations, brought in by force. On December 6, 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sends out the order that will start the war. All Indians living outside designated reservations must report to their agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile and subject to military action. January 31st. In the middle of the worst winter anyone can remember, when the snow lies belly-deep on a horse and the temperature drops to 40 below zero. When traveling more than a few miles means death for families with children and elderly relatives. When even the hardiest warriors stay close to their lodges and wait for spring. It's an impossible deadline, and everyone involved knows it's impossible. That's the point. The government wants the deadline to pass unmet. They want justification for military action. They want to be able to tell Congress and the American people that they tried negotiation, tried accommodation, tried everything short of force. And when force becomes necessary, it will be the Indians' fault for refusing reasonable terms. The messages carrying this ultimatum reach the winter camps through a network of mixed-blood traders and agency Indians willing to brave the storms. The reaction is exactly what you'd expect from people who've been pushed to the breaking point. Sitting Bull receives the message in his camp along the Powder River. His response is immediate and predictable. "Are you trying to scare me? Go back home where you came from." But privately, he begins preparations for the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history. Word spreads through the winter camps like grass fire. The whites have finally dropped all pretense. They want the Black Hills, they want the hunting grounds, they want everything. And they're willing to start a war to get it. But here's what the government officials in Washington don't understand, sitting in their heated offices, looking at neat lines on maps. They think they're dealing with scattered bands of primitives who can be easily defeated by modern military force. They have no comprehension of what they've just unleashed, because by demanding that all hostile Indians surrender by an impossible deadline, they've given Sitting Bull exactly what he's been waiting for, a cause that will unite every traditional band, every independent chief, every warrior who refuses to live like a reservation dog. Through the brutal winter of 1875 to 1876, as blizzards howl across the plains and temperatures plunge to depths that kill exposed flesh in minutes, something unprecedented begins to happen. Lakota families start slipping away from the agencies, heading into the unceded territory to join Sitting Bull. Cheyenne warriors abandon their rations and their government-issued blankets to join the gathering resistance. Arapaho fighters disappear from their assigned lands. They're not just answering Sitting Bull's call, they're answering something deeper, older, more powerful than any government decree. They're answering the call of a people who refuse to disappear, who would rather die fighting than live in captivity, who have decided that some things are worth more than life itself. In the scattered camps across Montana Territory, preparations begin for what everyone knows will be the final confrontation. Warriors clean their weapons and gather ammunition. Women make extra moccasins and war shirts. Holy men conduct ceremonies and seek visions of what's coming, and in those visions they see soldiers. Lots of soldiers, more soldiers than have ever been sent against the Plains tribes. Coming from 3 directions, converging like the points of a triangle, designed to crush the gathered resistance once and for all. The sacred Black Hills have been stolen. The treaties have been broken. The ultimatum has been delivered and rejected. Now there's nothing left but war, and both sides are about to get more war than they bargained for. February 1st, 1876. The deadline has passed, and not a single hostile Indian has reported to the agencies. In Washington, this comes as no surprise to anyone. It was designed to fail. What does surprise the War Department is the intelligence reports coming in from the frontier. Instead of scattered bands hiding in remote camps, the hostiles are gathering in numbers that make seasoned Indian fighters nervous. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, looks at these reports and sees opportunity. Sheridan is the man who burned the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War, who said the only good Indian is a dead Indian, who's made his reputation through total war. To him, having all the hostiles in one place isn't a problem, it's a solution. One decisive campaign can end the Plains Indian Wars forever. The plan Sheridan develops is elegantly simple in concept, brutally complex in execution. 3 separate columns will converge on the hostile camps from 3 different directions, like the jaws of a giant trap closing. No matter which way the Indians run, they'll meet United States cavalry. No matter how they try to scatter, at least one column will be positioned to intercept them. It's the largest coordinated military operation ever mounted against Plains Indians. Over 2,500 soldiers, supported by pack trains, supply wagons, artillery, and Gatling guns. Enough firepower to defeat a European army. Surely enough to handle a few thousand primitives armed with bows and arrows. But here's what makes this campaign different from every other Indian war the army has fought. They're not chasing scattered raiders or attacking sleeping villages. They're marching toward the largest gathering of Plains Indian military power in history, led by the greatest war chiefs the tribes have ever produced. Defending what they see as their very existence, the first column forms up at Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, under the command of Brigadier General George Crook. 3 stars to the Indians, who respect him as a fair fighter and a worthy enemy. Crook has over 1,000 men. The 2nd and 3rd Cavalry, the 4th and 9th Infantry, plus pack trains and artillery. His mission is to advance north from Wyoming into the Powder River country, driving any hostiles he encounters toward the other 2 columns. Crook is methodical, careful, professional. He's fought Apaches in Arizona, where rushing into combat gets you killed by an enemy who knows every rock and canyon. He understands that Indian warfare is different from conventional military operations. You don't fight pitched battles. You fight ambushes, raids, running fights across impossible terrain. Victory goes to whoever makes the fewest mistakes. The second column assembles at Fort Ellis, Montana, under Colonel John Gibbon, the one who limps to the Indians because of a Civil War wound that never properly healed. Gibbon has 450 men, the 7th Infantry, and 4 companies of the 2nd Cavalry. His job is to march east along the Yellowstone River, blocking any escape routes to the north and west. Gibbon is steady, reliable, unspectacular, exactly the kind of officer you want commanding a blocking force. He's not looking for glory, just trying to do his job competently. His men trust him because he doesn't take unnecessary risks with their lives. In the kind of campaign Sheridan is planning, that reliability is going to be crucial, but it's the third column that gets all the attention. And that's not accidental. Forming up at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, under Brigadier General Alfred Terry, this column includes the entire 7th Cavalry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. 600 men on horseback, the cream of the frontier army, led by the most famous Indian fighter in America. Terry is the overall commander, but everyone knows this is Custer's show. The newspapers are already calling it Custer's Expedition. The correspondents are filing stories about the dashing cavalry leader riding out to avenge the Black Hills treachery. Custer himself is feeding the publicity machine, posing for photographers, giving interviews, making sure everyone knows that George Armstrong Custer is riding to war. But there's a problem, and it almost derails the entire campaign before it starts. In March 1876, Custer is called to Washington to testify before a congressional committee investigating corruption in the Grant administration, specifically corruption involving the sale of trading post licenses at Army forts, licenses that should go to honest merchants but often end up in the hands of cronies who overcharge soldiers and cheat Indians. Custer testifies that Secretary of War William Belknap is taking kickbacks from these trading post deals. He names names, provides details, essentially accuses the Secretary of War of being a crook, which Belknap absolutely is. The evidence is overwhelming. But you don't accuse cabinet members of corruption without consequences, even when you're right. President Grant is furious. Not because Custer is lying, everyone knows Belknap is corrupt, but because Custer is grandstanding, turning a legitimate investigation into a personal publicity stunt. Grant strips Custer of his command and orders him confined to Fort Abraham Lincoln under virtual house arrest. This should be the end of Custer's military career. But here's where politics and personality collide in ways that change history. Without Custer, the spring campaign loses its star attraction. The newspapers lose their favorite story. The public loses interest in what should be the final solution to the Indian problem. General Terry pleads with Grant to reconsider. Sheridan argues that Custer's experience is essential to the campaign's success. Even Sherman, who can't stand Custer personally, admits that the 7th Cavalry needs its most experienced Indian fighter. More importantly, Custer himself launches a lobbying campaign that would make modern politicians proud. He pulls every string, calls in every favor, appeals to every influential contact he's made during his years of publicity seeking. The message is always the same. The country needs George Armstrong Custer to solve the Indian problem. Finally, Grant gives in. Sort of. Custer can go on the campaign, but only as a regimental commander under Terry's direct supervision. No independent operations, no detached commands, no opportunities for the kind of glory-seeking that made him famous. Just follow orders and do your job. Custer agrees instantly. He's so desperate to get back in the field that he'll accept any conditions. But privately, he's already planning how to turn tactical subordination into strategic independence. He's George Armstrong Custer. He'll find a way to grab the headlines. May 17th, 1876. The Dakota column marches out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in the gray dawn light, and it's a sight that captures the imagination of everyone who sees it. 600 cavalry troopers in columns of 4, sabers rattling, guidons snapping in the wind. Behind them roll the supply wagons, the ammunition carts, the pack trains loaded with everything needed for a summer campaign. At the head of the column rides Custer himself, and he's dressed for the part. Fringed buckskins instead of regulation uniform, wide-brimmed hat instead of military cap, his famous golden hair flowing in the breeze. He looks exactly like what newspaper illustrators think a frontier hero should look like. But Elizabeth Custer, watching from the porch of their quarters, sees something different. She sees her husband riding toward what feels like doom. Years later, she'll write about that morning. "I have a strange premonition about this campaign. I feel as if I shall never see my husband again." The column disappears into the vastness of Dakota Territory, heading west toward the Yellowstone River and whatever awaits them there. Behind them, the fort settles into the quiet routine of peacetime. Ahead lies the largest concentration of hostile Indians anyone has ever assembled. While the 3 columns are organizing and marching, let me tell you what's happening in the camps they're trying to destroy. Because this isn't just a military gathering. It's a cultural renaissance, a spiritual awakening, the last great flowering of Plains Indian civilization. Through the winter and spring of 1876, families stream into Sitting Bull's camp along the Powder River, not just warriors, but entire communities, men, women, children, elderly, everyone who refuses to accept reservation life. By May, there are over 3,000 people in the hostile camps, with more arriving every day. But it's not chaos. It's organized resistance on a scale the Plains tribes have never achieved before. Different bands camp in specific areas according to ancient protocols. The Hunkpapa Lakota under Sitting Bull, the Oglala under Crazy Horse, the Minneconjou under Lame Deer, the Cheyenne under Two Moons, the Arapaho under Left Hand. Each group maintains its own leadership and traditions while contributing to the common defense. The camp moves constantly, following the buffalo herds and staying ahead of the advancing columns. But this isn't just strategic mobility, it's spiritual preparation. Holy men conduct ceremonies, seeking visions of what's coming. Warriors purify themselves through sweat lodges and sacred rituals. The entire gathering takes on the atmosphere of a massive religious revival, and at the center of it all is Sitting Bull, preparing for the most important ceremony of his life. In early June, as the military columns close in from 3 directions, Sitting Bull announces that he will perform the sun dance, the most sacred and demanding of all Lakota rituals. For 3 days, he will dance without food or water while sharp awls pierce his flesh and tear away pieces of skin. He will dance until he receives a vision of what the spirits have planned for his people. The sun dance takes place at a camp near the Rosebud River, and it's witnessed by thousands of Indians from dozens of different bands. For hours, Sitting Bull dances around the sacred pole while blood streams down his arms and chest. Finally, near collapse from exhaustion and blood loss, he receives the vision that will change everything. He sees soldiers falling into the Indian camp like grasshoppers from the sky. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, falling headfirst with their hats off. The spirits tell him, "These soldiers have no ears," meaning they won't listen to reason, won't negotiate, won't stop until they're defeated. But they will be defeated. The vision promises complete victory for the assembled tribes. Word of Sitting Bull's vision spreads through the camps like wildfire. Warriors who've been uncertain about fighting the whites suddenly become eager for battle. Families who've been wavering between resistance and surrender commit themselves to the hostile cause. The entire gathering transforms from a defensive alliance into an offensive weapon. But while the Indians are receiving spiritual encouragement, the military columns are encountering problems that no amount of planning could anticipate. Crook's column strikes first, attacking a Cheyenne and Oglala village on the Powder River in March. It should be a routine dawn assault on a sleeping camp, the kind of operation the Army has conducted dozens of times. Instead, it turns into a disaster. The attack initially succeeds. Cavalry charges into the village, scattering the inhabitants, capturing horses and lodges. But then, the warriors regroup and counterattack with a ferocity that shocks the soldiers. Led by Crazy Horse himself, they drive the cavalry back, recapture most of their horses, and inflict casualties the army can't afford. Worse, the attack has warned the hostile camps that the military campaign has begun. The element of surprise, crucial to Sheridan's strategy, is gone. From now on, the Indians will be watching for approaching columns, ready to fight or flee as circumstances dictate. Crook regroups and advances deeper into Montana territory, but his men are already nervous. These aren't the demoralized reservation Indians they expected to fight. These are confident, well-armed warriors, led by chiefs who know how to use terrain and mobility to their advantage. On June 17th, 1876, Crook gets a lesson in just how dangerous these primitives can be. His column is advancing along Rosebud Creek when Crazy Horse hits him with over 1,000 warriors in a coordinated attack that lasts 6 hours. The Battle of the Rosebud isn't like the small-scale skirmishes the army is used to fighting. This is a full-scale engagement with battle lines, flanking movements, coordinated charges, plains Indian warfare at its most sophisticated. Crazy Horse doesn't just raid and retreat. He fights Crook to a standstill, forcing the general to withdraw and abandon his advance toward the hostile camps. Think about what this means for Sheridan's grand strategy. One of his 3 columns has been stopped cold, unable to continue its mission. The jaws of the trap aren't closing. They're being pried apart by an enemy that's proving far more capable than anyone anticipated. But news of Crook's defeat doesn't reach the other 2 columns. Communication across the vast distances of Montana territory is sporadic at best. Terry and Gibbon assume Crook is continuing his advance from the south, and they proceed with their own missions. On June 21st, the Terry and Gibbon columns meet at the confluence of the Rosebud and Yellowstone rivers. It's here that the final phase of the campaign gets planned, and here that Custer gets his chance to grab the glory he's been seeking. Terry calls a conference aboard the steamboat Far West, which has been following the Yellowstone River to supply the converging columns. Present are Terry himself, Gibbon and Custer, plus their senior staff officers. The mood is confident, almost jovial. They've found the hostile camps. Scout reports indicate a large village somewhere along the Little Bighorn River. Now, it's just a matter of coordinated movement to surround and capture them. The plan Terry develops seems foolproof. Gibbon will take his infantry and march south along the Bighorn River, moving slowly but steadily to block any escape routes to the north. Meanwhile, Custer will take the entire 7th Cavalry and swing south along the Rosebud, then west to the Little Bighorn Valley. The 2 forces will converge on the hostile camps from opposite directions, trapping the Indians between them. It's exactly the kind of operation Sheridan envisioned. Methodical, coordinated, overwhelming. What could go wrong? But then Custer makes a request that changes everything. He asks Terry for additional firepower, the Gatling guns that have been accompanying the column, and 4 additional companies of infantry for dismounted fighting. Terry agrees instantly. With that kind of firepower, the 7th Cavalry should be able to handle whatever they encounter, except Custer immediately changes his mind. The Gatling guns will slow his march, he argues. The infantry can't keep up with cavalry movement. He wants to move fast, strike hard, win decisively. He doesn't need extra firepower, he needs speed and mobility. Terry is puzzled but doesn't argue. Custer is the experienced Indian fighter, the man who knows plains warfare better than anyone. If he thinks the 7th Cavalry can handle the job alone, then that's probably right. What Terry doesn't understand, what nobody understands except maybe Custer himself, is that this isn't a tactical decision. It's a personal one. Custer doesn't want to share credit for the victory with Gatling gun crews or infantry companies. He wants this to be a pure cavalry triumph, a 7th Cavalry triumph, a George Armstrong Custer triumph. On the morning of June 22nd, 1876, The 7th Cavalry rides out from the mouth of the Rosebud River. 647 officers and men, the largest cavalry regiment ever assembled for Indian fighting. At their head rides Custer himself, confident, eager, already planning the victory dispatches he'll send to the newspapers. Behind him ride the 12 companies of the 7th, each with its own character and reputation. Company A, the Greys, mounted on matching grey horses. Company K, Custer's old Civil War company, full of veterans who've followed him through a dozen campaigns. Companies led by men like Miles Keogh, an Irish soldier of fortune who's fought in Europe and America. George Yates, Custer's longtime friend and confidant. James Calhoun, married to Custer's sister and part of the extended Custer family that dominates the regiment's officer corps. Also riding with the column are Indian Scouts, Arikara warriors who've served the army faithfully for years, and Crow Scouts who know the Yellowstone country better than any white man. These men are nervous in a way that should warn the cavalry officers. They're reading signs that speak of enormous numbers of hostiles, of a gathering unlike anything they've ever seen, but the white officers aren't listening to their scouts. They're listening to their own confidence, their own assumptions about Indian fighting, their own belief that superior firepower and military discipline will triumph over savage numbers. For 3 days, the 7th Cavalry follows the trail of the hostile camps up the Rosebud Valley. It's easy to follow. Thousands of people and horses leave tracks that are visible for miles. Lodgepole travois have worn deep ruts in the prairie soil. The remains of campsites show cooking fires that fed hundreds of families. By June 24th, even the most optimistic officers are beginning to realize they're following a very large village. The scout reports are consistent. At least 2,000 warriors, maybe 3,000, possibly more. Numbers that make the 600 men of the 7th Cavalry seem suddenly very small. That night, camped along the Rosebud, Custer calls together his officers for a final conference. The mood is tense. Everyone can feel that tomorrow will bring the confrontation they've been riding toward, and nobody is entirely confident about the outcome. Custer tries to project his usual optimism, but there's something forced about it. He talks about the regiment's proud history, about their duty to end the Indian Wars, about the glory waiting for those brave enough to seize it. But his officers notice something they've never seen before. Uncertainty in their commander's voice. Major Marcus Reno asks the obvious question, shouldn't they wait for Gibbon's column before attacking? Shouldn't they coordinate with General Terry as ordered? Shouldn't they at least send word of what they found? Custer's response reveals everything about his mindset. The Indians will scatter if they wait, he argues. This is their chance to end the Indian Wars with one decisive blow. History will remember the regiment that destroys Sitting Bull's power forever. What he doesn't say, what he can't admit even to himself, is that he's terrified of sharing the victory. Terrified that Gibbon will arrive in time to claim part of the credit. Terrified that the greatest Indian fight of all time will become a footnote to someone else's career. As the officers return to their companies to prepare for what everyone knows will be the battle of their lives, Custer sits alone by his campfire, staring into the flames and thinking about destiny. Tomorrow, George Armstrong Custer will either become the greatest Indian fighter in American history, or he'll become something else entirely. Neither he nor any of his 600 men have any idea that less than 20 miles away, in the largest Indian gathering in Plains history, thousands of warriors are sharpening their weapons and preparing for the fight that will determine the future of two peoples. The trap Sheridan designed to catch the hostiles is about to spring, but it's going to close on the wrong prey. June 25, 1876. Dawn breaks hot and still over the Montana Badlands, and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer is about to make the decision that will echo through American history for the next century and beyond. His Crow Scouts have been riding hard since before sunrise, and they're bringing news that should terrify any rational commander. From the Crow's Nest, a high ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, they've seen the largest Indian village any of them have ever imagined. lodges stretching for miles along the river. Horse herds so vast they look like buffalo. Smoke from cooking fires rising like a forest in the morning air. White man runs him. The head Crow Scout tries to explain what they've seen using a mixture of sign language and broken English. He points toward the valley and spreads his hands wide, then wider, then shakes his head as if words can't capture the reality. Too many, he keeps saying. Too many Lakota, but Custer isn't listening. Not really. He's looking through his field glasses at dust clouds in the distance, and all he sees is opportunity slipping away. The village is huge, yes, but that just means the victory will be more complete. The glory will be greater. The headlines will be bigger. Here's what's going through Custer's mind as he crouches on that ridge, studying the valley that will become his grave. He's thinking about newspaper accounts of his triumph. He's imagining the ticker tape parades when he returns east. He's seeing himself as the man who ended the Indian Wars, who solved the problem that has bedeviled the frontier for decades. What he's not thinking about, what his entire military education has trained him not to think about, is the possibility of defeat. American cavalry doesn't lose to Indians. It's axiomatically impossible. Indians might win skirmishes, might escape encirclement, might inflict casualties, but they don't destroy entire regiments of United States cavalry. It simply doesn't happen, except it's about to happen. Around noon, Custer makes the decision that seals everyone's fate. Instead of waiting for Gibbon's column as Terry ordered, instead of conducting reconnaissance to determine the village's exact size and disposition, instead of sending for the Gatling guns he refused just 3 days earlier, he decides to attack immediately. His reasoning is classically Custer. The Indians have spotted his column and will scatter if he delays. Better to strike now with surprise on his side than wait and find an empty village. Besides, 600 cavalry. Troopers should be more than enough to handle whatever they encounter down there, but then Custer makes his second fatal decision. He divides his force. This is standard cavalry doctrine when attacking Indian villages. You split your command to hit multiple points simultaneously, preventing escape and creating confusion among the defenders. It's worked dozens of times before against smaller camps. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Custer splits the 7th Cavalry into 3 separate battalions. Major Marcus Reno gets companies A, G, and M, 175 men, with orders to charge the southern end of the village while Custer attacks from the north. Captain Frederick Benteen takes companies D, H, and K, 125 men, on a wide sweep to the south and west, making sure no Indians escape in that direction. That leaves Custer himself with companies C, E, F, I, and L, 210 men, for what he assumes will be the decisive blow against the village center. It's a plan that looks good on paper and has worked before against smaller targets. But this isn't a smaller target, and the men Custer is about to attack aren't the demoralized agency Indians he's used to fighting. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Major Reno leads his battalion across the Little Bighorn River at what history will call Reno's Ford. The water is chest-deep on the horses, the current swift enough to require careful navigation. On the far bank, they form into a battle line, 3 companies abreast, guidons flying, sabers drawn. What happens next destroys every assumption about Plains Indian warfare that the U.S. Army has held for decades. Instead of fleeing families and scattered resistance, Reno's charge runs headlong into a coordinated defense by hundreds of warriors who've been expecting this attack since Sitting Bull's vision. Gall, the massive Hunkpapa war chief, leads the counterattack after cavalry bullets kill his 2 wives and 3 children in the initial moments of battle. Think about that for a second. Imagine watching soldiers shoot down your family, and then having to organize a military response while your heart is exploding with grief and rage. That's what Gall does, and it transforms what should have been a tactical engagement into something primal and terrible. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors don't scatter, they swarm. Like angry wasps defending their nest, they emerge from lodges, from concealed positions along the river, from draws and coulees that Reno's men never saw. Within minutes, Reno's charge has stalled completely, his men fighting for their lives against overwhelming numbers. But here's where Reno's personal demons catch up with him. Under pressure, facing a situation that's spiraling out of control, he makes the decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of maintaining his position and fighting defensively, instead of trying to link up with Custer's battalion, instead of conducting an orderly withdrawal, he panics. Dismount and fight on foot. Reno orders, then almost immediately countermands himself. Mount up! We're getting out of here! The retreat across the Little Bighorn becomes a slaughter. Men and horses shot down in the water, bodies floating downstream. Survivors struggling up the far bank under continuous fire. Bloody Knife, Custer's favorite Arikara scout, takes a bullet through the head, his blood and brains spattering across Reno's face and uniform. The survivors, what's left of them, dig in on a hilltop that will forever be known as Reno Hill. They're surrounded, under siege, wondering what happened to the rest of the regiment and trying not to think too hard about the answer. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen is leading his 3 companies on a wild goose chase across the Badlands south of the Little Bighorn. His orders were vague: sweep south and west, make sure no Indians escape, and he's interpreting them literally. For hours, he rides through broken country, seeing nothing but empty prairie and occasional small groups of fleeing non-combatants. It's not until he hears heavy firing from the direction of the village that Benteen realizes the battle has started without him. He turns his battalion around and heads toward the sound of gunfire. But he's miles away and moving slowly. Whatever's happening at the Little Bighorn will be decided before he can influence the outcome, which brings us to George Armstrong Custer and the 210 men riding with him toward immortality. From high ground north of the village, Custer can see Reno's attack developing and the massive Indian response it's triggering. Any rational commander would recognize that his assumptions about enemy numbers were catastrophically wrong, that his divided force is facing annihilation. That immediate retreat is the only hope for survival. But Custer isn't thinking rationally anymore. He's thinking like a gambler who's bet everything on one hand and can't fold even when he knows he's beaten. Retreat means admitting failure, means sharing the blame for a botched operation, means watching his reputation crumble in the newspapers that have built him up for so many years. So instead of retreating, instead of trying to rescue Reno's battered command, instead of waiting for Benteen to return, Custer makes his final fatal decision. He's going to attack the village himself from the north, hoping to create enough confusion to allow Reno's men to escape, while still claiming some kind of victory for himself. It's desperation masquerading as boldness, and it's about to get everyone killed. Custer leads his 5 companies along the ridges overlooking the Little Bighorn, looking for a good crossing point, a place where cavalry can ford the river and charge into the village. What he doesn't realize, what he can't see from his elevated position, is that his movement is being tracked by hundreds of warriors who are now streaming north to intercept him. Crazy. Horse is leading this flanking movement, and he's about to demonstrate why the Lakota consider him their greatest war leader. While Gall and the other chiefs hold Reno's survivors on their hilltop, Crazy Horse takes every available warrior and circles wide to the north, positioning himself between Custer and any possible escape route. It's a tactical masterpiece, a double envelopment that would have impressed Napoleon. The Indians aren't just reacting to cavalry attacks anymore. They're dictating the terms of engagement, forcing the soldiers to fight when, where, and how the warriors choose. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Custer's battalion reaches a point later called Medicine Tail Coulee, where a dry creek bed offers a potential route down to the river. From here they can see the village spread out below them, mile after mile of lodges. Thousands of people, horse herds beyond counting, even now. Even at this late moment, some of Custer's officers are trying to talk sense into their commander. Captain Miles Keogh, the Irish veteran of European wars, suggests they withdraw and link up with the rest of the regiment. First Lieutenant James Calhoun, Custer's own brother-in-law, argues for finding a defensive position and waiting for reinforcements, but Custer has gone beyond listening to advice. He's entered that zone of supreme confidence and supreme delusion that sometimes overtakes commanders in desperate situations. He's convinced himself that one decisive charge will break Indian resistance, that superior discipline will triumph over superior numbers, that George Armstrong Custer is destined for victory, no matter what the odds. "We've got them this time, boys," he shouts to his men. "We'll finish them off and then go home to our station." The charge down Medicine Tail Coulee begins around 4:15. 210 cavalry troopers, sabers drawn, guidons flying, riding toward the Little Bighorn River and the largest concentration of hostile Indians in the history of the American frontier. They make it maybe halfway before the trap closes. Warriors rise from concealment along both sides of the coulee, positions they've occupied since Crazy Horse's flanking movement got into place. Rifle fire pours down from the ridges, crossfire that turns the narrow valley into a killing ground. Horses scream and fall, men tumble from their saddles. The carefully ordered charge dissolves into chaos and terror. The survivors fight their way back up the coulee toward the high ground, but there's no safety there either. Crazy Horse has positioned warriors on the ridges behind them, cutting off their retreat. Gall is bringing hundreds more fighters from the successful defense against Reno. The ring is closing, tightening, becoming inescapable. What follows is unlike anything in the annals of Plains Indian warfare. This isn't a raid or a skirmish or even a battle in the conventional sense. It's the systematic destruction of an entire military unit by an enemy that has achieved perfect tactical coordination. The soldiers try to form defensive positions on the various hilltops and ridges, but they're outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, possibly more. Every time they establish a firing line, warriors infiltrate behind them. Every time they try to move to a better position, they're caught in the open and cut down by concentrated fire. Companies E and F, under Captain George Yates and Captain Miles Keogh, make a desperate stand on a ridge later named Calhoun Hill. They fight in classic cavalry style, dismounted, using their horses for cover, firing by volleys to conserve ammunition. For maybe 20 minutes, their discipline holds the warriors at bay, but 20 minutes isn't long enough. The warriors are using terrain, concealment, and superior numbers to get closer and closer to the defensive positions. When they finally charge, hundreds of them simultaneously from multiple directions, the cavalry line collapses like a dam bursting. Company I, under Captain Keogh, tries to retreat toward Custer's position on the highest ridge, but they're caught in a crossfire that destroys the unit in minutes. Georg himself, the professional soldier who's fought on battlefields across Europe and America, dies with his revolver in one hand and his company guidon in the other. By now, the situation has devolved into something beyond military terminology. It's not a battle anymore. It's a massacre, a slaughter, the methodical killing of trapped men who have no hope of escape and no chance of victory. The final act plays out on the ridge that will forever bear Custer's name. Here, with maybe 40 or 50 survivors from the original 210, George Armstrong Custer makes his last stand. The men form a rough circle, using dead horses for barricades, firing at targets they can barely see through the dust and smoke. Custer himself, accounts differ on the details, but all agree on the essential facts, fights to the very end. Whether he's killed by a rifle bullet from long range or dies in hand-to-hand combat with a warrior who's reached the defensive perimeter, whether he falls early in the final assault or is one of the last men standing, whether he dies instantly or lives long enough to know his command is destroyed, these details will be debated for generations. What's not debatable is the outcome. By 6 o'clock in the evening, maybe 6:30, every single man who rode with Custer down Medicine Tail Coulee is dead. 210 soldiers, scouts, and civilians, the largest single-day loss in the history of the Indian Wars. The killing stops as suddenly as it began. Warriors move among the bodies, taking weapons and ammunition, stripping uniforms, counting coup on fallen enemies. But there's no celebration, no war dancing, no scalp taking on the scale you might expect. The magnitude of what they've accomplished seems to surprise even the victors. Sitting Bull, surveying the battlefield where his Sundance vision has come to pass, speaks words that will be remembered long after the gunsmoke clears. Today we have killed Longhair and all his men, but this will bring more soldiers, like grass in spring. We must scatter and hide, for now the white man's vengeance will be terrible. Meanwhile, on Reno Hill, the survivors of the southern attack are still under siege. They can hear the gunfire from Custer's battle, but they have no idea what it means. Some hope it signals Custer's breakthrough into the village. Others fear it means the colonel is facing the same overwhelming numbers that destroyed Reno's charge. Captain Benteen, finally, arrives with his 3 companies and the pack train carrying the regiment's reserve ammunition. His men are fresh, well-supplied, eager to get into the fight. But one look at the battered survivors on the hilltop tells Benteen everything he needs to know about the day's events. "Where's Custer?" Reno asks, and there's something in his voice, hope mixed with dread, that suggests he already knows the answer. Benteen looks toward the ridges where the gunfire was heaviest, where dust clouds are still settling in the evening air, where an ominous silence has replaced the thunder of battle. "I think," he says quietly, "we have other things to worry about right now." The siege of Reno Hill continues through the night and into the next day. 7 companies of the 7th Cavalry, nearly half the regiment, pinned down on a barren hilltop, surrounded by warriors who could overrun them any time they choose. The men dig rifle pits with knives and mess cups, ration their water and ammunition, and try not to think about what happened to the rest of their comrades. But on the morning of June 27th, the warriors begin to withdraw. Not in defeat. They've won the greatest victory in Plains Indian history. They're withdrawing because they understand what Sitting Bull understood immediately after the battle. Victory will bring vengeance, and vengeance will be overwhelming. The great village breaks up, scattering in all directions like seeds on the wind. Within days, the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history has dissolved back into the vastness of the northern plains, leaving behind only the evidence of what they've accomplished. When Colonel Gibbon's column finally reaches the Little Bighorn Valley on June 27th, they find a sight that no one who sees it will ever forget. Bodies scattered across miles of ridges and coulees, stripped, mutilated, bloating in the summer heat. The remnants of guidons and equipment, the carcasses of cavalry horses, the debris of military disaster on a scale unprecedented in frontier warfare. And on the ridge that will forever bear his name, they find George Armstrong Custer, the man who rode out seeking glory, who divided his command in pursuit of headlines, who refused to wait for support because he couldn't bear to share credit for victory. The boy general who survived every Civil War battle only to die in a place most Americans had never heard of, fighting an enemy he never really understood. The news of Custer's defeat reaches the East on July 4th, 1876, America's centennial, the 100th anniversary of independence. As the nation celebrates its first century of existence, telegraph wires carry word of the most shocking military defeat since the Civil War. The reaction is immediate, overwhelming, and predictable. Grief for the fallen heroes, rage at the savage victors, demands for total war, complete vengeance, final solution to the Indian problem. The defeat at Little Bighorn, which should have demonstrated the futility of trying to conquer a people fighting for their homeland, instead becomes justification for exactly that kind of conquest. Sitting Bull was right. The victory will bring more soldiers like grass in spring, and this time they won't stop until every Plains tribe is on a reservation. Every buffalo is dead. Every warrior is either killed or broken. The battle that was supposed to end the Indian Wars has instead guaranteed that they will continue until one side or the other is completely destroyed. And everyone knows which side has the factories, the railroads, the endless supply of soldiers and settlers. Little Bighorn was the high tide of Plains Indian resistance. From this moment forward, it's all retreat, all defeat, all the long, slow collapse of a way of life that had flourished on the Great Plains for centuries. But for one perfect day in June 1876, in a valley where the Little Bighorn River winds through the Montana grassland, the warriors fought like their ancestors and won like their ancestors, and proved that some things are worth dying. For even when you know that dying won't change the final outcome, the telegram arrives at Army headquarters in Chicago on July 5, 1876, just as the nation is nursing hangovers from its centennial celebration. 26 words that will shake America to its core. Custer attacked the Indians 25th, and he and his entire command were killed. Renault, with 7 companies, fought them 36 hours and was finally relieved by Gibbon. 26 words to describe the destruction of the most famous cavalry regiment in America, the death of the most celebrated Indian fighter on the frontier, the most shocking military defeat since the Civil War. But those 26 words are just the beginning of a story that will reshape the American West and doom the Plains tribes to extinction. Within hours, newspaper editors across the country are scrambling to rewrite their front pages. The centennial celebrations, the patriotic speeches, the optimistic editorials about America's bright future, all of it gets shoved aside for headlines that scream variations of the same unthinkable message. Custer massacred and entire command wiped out, and savages triumph at Little Bighorn. But here's what's fascinating about the initial reaction. It's not just shock and grief. It's bewilderment. How could this happen? How could 600 trained cavalrymen, armed with the latest weapons, led by experienced officers, be completely destroyed by primitive Indians with bows and arrows? The answer, of course, is that the Indians weren't primitive, weren't armed with just bows and arrows, and weren't the scattered, demoralized bands that Army intelligence had predicted. But admitting that would mean admitting that the entire Indian policy of the United States was based on fundamental misconceptions about the people they were trying to conquer. So instead, the newspapers create a narrative that preserves American assumptions while explaining American defeat. Custer and his men weren't outfought. They were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They weren't outmaneuvered. They were the victims of treachery and savage cunning. They didn't lose a battle. They died as heroes, martyrs to the cause of civilization and progress. Within weeks, artists who've never been west of the Mississippi are painting dramatic scenes of Custer's last stand. Publishers are rushing biographies of the boy general into print. Poets are composing verses about the noble sacrifice in the Montana wilderness. The defeat at Little Bighorn is being transformed into something more palatable to American sensibilities. A glorious failure, a heroic last stand, a Christ-like sacrifice for the greater good, and this myth-making has real consequences, because it shapes the national response to what happened at Little Bighorn. Instead of reconsidering Indian policy, instead of questioning whether the Plains tribes might have legitimate grievances, instead of exploring whether coexistence might be possible, America doubles down on total war congress, which had been reluctant to fund large-scale military operations against the Indians, suddenly opens the treasury. Within months of Little Bighorn, the army has more soldiers, more supplies and more money than it's had since the Civil War. The defeat that should have demonstrated the impossibility of conquering a people fighting for their homeland instead becomes justification for exactly that kind of conquest. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding general of the U.S. Army, puts the new policy in terms that leave no room for misunderstanding. We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. Extermination. Not defeat, not pacification, not removal to reservations. Extermination, the complete elimination of the Lakota people as a distinct entity. And Sherman isn't speaking metaphorically. He means exactly what he says. The man chosen to implement this policy is Colonel Nelson A. Miles, and he's exactly the right person for the job if your job is the systematic destruction of Plains Indian resistance. Miles is everything Custer pretended to be, a genuine military genius, a student of warfare, a commander who wins through preparation and professionalism rather than publicity, stunts and reckless courage. Miles understands something that most army officers don't. That Plains Indian warfare is fundamentally different from conventional military operations. You don't fight pitched battles against tribes that can scatter like smoke and reassemble like mercury. You fight a war of attrition, targeting their resources, their mobility, their ability to maintain traditional life. Most importantly, Miles understands that the real enemy isn't the warriors, it's the buffalo. Take away the buffalo herds, and the Plains tribes lose their food, their shelter, their clothing, their entire economic foundation. Force them to depend on government rations, and you can control them completely. So while other commanders are chasing war parties across the prairie, Miles is coordinating the systematic elimination of the buffalo herds that sustain Plains Indian civilization. He's not just fighting a military campaign, he's conducting genocide by starvation. The buffalo slaughter that follows Little Bighorn is one of the most efficient extinction campaigns in human history. Professional hide hunters, armed with long-range rifles and subsidized by railroad companies, kill millions of buffalo over the next 5 years. Entire herds that stretched from horizon to horizon disappear in a matter of months. Think about these numbers, because they're almost impossible to comprehend. In 1870, there are an estimated 60 million buffalo on the Great Plains. By 1880, there are fewer than 1,000. 60 million to 1,000 in 10 years. It's environmental destruction on a scale that makes modern industrial disasters look modest by comparison. And it's completely deliberate. General Sheridan, asked by Texas legislators to protect the remaining buffalo herds, tells them, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. The buffalo hunters aren't just killing animals, they're killing a civilization. Every buffalo that falls is a Lakota family that will go hungry next winter. Every herd that disappears is a band that will have to choose between starvation and surrender. Every hide shipped east on the railroad is another step toward the complete transformation of the Great Plains, but the immediate military response to Little Bighorn is just as devastating as the long-term environmental campaign. Miles takes to the field in the summer of 1876 with clear orders: find the scattered bands, attack them wherever they are, show no mercy to anyone who resists. His first target is Sitting Bull himself, the spiritual leader whose Sundance vision made Little Bighorn possible. But Sitting Bull proves as elusive in defeat as he was dangerous in victory. Every time Miles closes in on the Hunkpapa camp, Sitting Bull slips away, leading his people deeper into the Badlands, farther from the advancing soldiers. The cat-and-mouse game continues through the fall and into winter, with Miles pursuing and Sitting Bull retreating. But this isn't really a military campaign anymore. It's a war of endurance, and the Indians are losing it by degrees. Without the buffalo herds, the bands can't maintain their traditional nomadic lifestyle. Hunting parties return empty-handed from ranges that once teemed with game. Women and children go hungry, while warriors spend their time fleeing soldiers instead of providing for their families. The old life is dying day by day, meal by meal, mile by mile of retreat. In October 1876, Miles catches up with Sitting Bull along the Yellowstone River. But instead of immediately attacking, he does something unprecedented. He arranges a face-to-face meeting with the Lakota leader to discuss terms for surrender. The meeting takes place on a hilltop between the two forces, and it's one of the most remarkable confrontations in frontier history. On one side stands Miles, 36 years old, representing the full power of the United States government. On the other side stands Sitting Bull, 45 years old, representing a way of life that's been flourishing on the Great Plains for centuries. Miles offers terms that sound generous. Surrender now, and the Lakota can keep their weapons, their horses, their dignity. Return to the reservation peacefully, and there will be no reprisals for little Bighorn. The government wants peace, Miles says, not vengeance. Sitting Bull's response is everything you'd expect from a man who spent his entire life refusing to compromise with forces that demand his people's extinction. God Almighty made me an Indian, and he did not make me an agency Indian, and I don't intend to be one. The talks break down, fighting resumes, and the long retreat continues. But everyone involved, Miles, Sitting Bull, the soldiers, the warriors, knows how this story ends. The Indians can win battles, but they can't win wars against an enemy with unlimited resources and unlimited patience. Through the winter of 1876 to 1877, the scattered bands face impossible choices. Stay free and watch their families starve, or surrender and accept reservation life. Fight and die as free people, or live as captives of a government that considers their culture a disease to be cured. One by one, the great chiefs make their decisions. Red Cloud, who once fought the army to a standstill, has been on the reservation for years, trying to work within the system to protect his people. Spotted Tail, the pragmatic Brule leader, negotiates the best terms he can get for bands willing to surrender. American Horse, Iron Hawk, and dozens of other leaders bring their followers into the agencies, trading freedom for food. But the two leaders who matter most, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, hold out through that brutal winter, leading their people in a desperate attempt to maintain the traditional life just a little longer. Crazy Horse, the mystical warrior who rode untouchable through every battle, faces a reality that no amount of spiritual power can change. His band is starving. His wife, Black Shawl, is dying of tuberculosis, the white man's disease that's killing Indians faster than bullets. His people are exhausted, demoralized, reduced to eating their horses to stay alive. In May 1877, Crazy Horse makes the decision that breaks every Lakota heart but saves every Lakota life under his protection. He brings his band, nearly 1,000 people, into the Red Cloud Agency to surrender. The scene at the agency is unlike anything in Plains Indian history. Crazy Horse, the man who never lost a battle, the warrior whose very name struck terror into his enemies, rides in at the head of a column that stretches for miles. Warriors who fought at Little Bighorn, women who followed the buffalo herds, children who've never seen a white settlement, all coming in to accept captivity as the price of survival. General George Crook, waiting at the agency to accept the surrender, is stunned by what he sees. This isn't a defeated rabble seeking mercy. It's a functioning military organization choosing to lay down arms rather than watch its people starve. The warriors are still armed, still mounted, still capable of fighting. They're surrendering from strength, not weakness, which makes their decision both more admirable and more tragic. Crazy Horse himself presents a figure that captures the imagination of everyone who sees him. Still young, only 36 years old, but aged by responsibility and loss. Still proud, but carrying the weight of knowing that his surrender marks the end of something that can never be recovered. The formal ceremony takes place on May 6, 1877. Crazy Horse dismounts, walks to where Crook is waiting, and hands over his rifle, the weapon that made him the most feared warrior on the plains. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet acknowledgement that resistance is over. But Crazy Horse's surrender doesn't bring the peace he was promised. Instead, it brings suspicion, jealousy, and ultimately betrayal by the very people he was trying to protect. The problem is that even in captivity, Crazy Horse remains dangerous to the reservation system. His mere presence reminds other Indians that there are alternatives to agency life, that resistance is possible, that the old ways don't have to die just because the government says they must. Worse, From the government's perspective, Crazy Horse refuses to play the role of defeated chief. He won't give speeches praising the white man's generosity. He won't encourage other Indians to accept reservation life. He won't become a symbol of successful pacification. Instead, he remains what he's always been, a free man who happens to be confined, a warrior who's laid down his weapons, but not his spirit. And that makes him incredibly dangerous to an administration that needs Indian leaders to validate its policies. Through the summer of 1877, tensions build around Crazy Horse and his followers. Agency officials spread rumors that he's planning to break out, to return to the warpath, to lead a new uprising. Other Indian leaders, jealous of his continued influence, whisper that he can't be trusted, that his surrender was a trick. The crisis comes in September, when Crazy Horse is ordered to report to Fort Robinson for consultations with military officials. He's told it's a routine meeting, a chance to discuss his people's needs and concerns. What he doesn't know, what nobody tells him, is that he's walking into a trap. On September 5, 1877, Crazy Horse arrives at Fort Robinson, accompanied by his friend, Little Big Man, and several other Lakota leaders. They're met by a military escort that guides them not to the commanding officer's quarters, but to the fort's guardhouse, the military prison. When Crazy Horse realizes he's being arrested, he tries to escape. There's a struggle, a scuffle, shouts in Lakota and English. And then a bayonet slides between his ribs, piercing his kidney, sending the greatest warrior in Lakota history to the ground, with blood spreading across his shirt. The soldier who kills Crazy Horse is named William Gentles, a private in the 9th Infantry who's probably never heard of the man he's just murdered. The irony is perfect and terrible. The warrior who survived every battle, who rode untouched through storms of bullets, who seemed blessed by the spirits themselves, dies at the hands of an anonymous enlisted man in a routine arrest gone wrong. Crazy Horse lives just long enough to speak his final words to his father. "Tell the people it is no use to depend on me anymore now." With those words, something dies that goes far beyond one man's life. The spirit of Plains Indian resistance, the belief that the old ways can survive in a changing world. The hope that traditional people can remain traditional, all of it dies with Crazy Horse in the dusty yard of a frontier fort. Meanwhile, Sitting Bull faces his own impossible choice. Unlike Crazy Horse, he refuses to surrender, leading his remaining followers across the border into Canada, the grandmother's land, where Queen Victoria's government offers sanctuary to American refugees. For 4 years, Sitting Bull and his people live in exile along the Saskatchewan River, technically free but practically prisoners of geography and politics. The Canadian government won't let them settle permanently, but it won't force them to return to the United States either. They exist in limbo, stateless people caught between two nations that would prefer they simply disappear. The exile years are almost harder than the war years. At least during the fighting, the Lakota were still living as Lakota, following the buffalo, conducting ceremonies, maintaining their culture. In Canada, they're refugees dependent on government rations, cut off from their traditional hunting grounds, slowly losing the connections that make them who they are. By 1881, even Sitting Bull can see that exile is just another form of slow death. The buffalo are gone from both sides of the border. His people are hungry, demoralized, reduced to begging for food from Canadian officials who make it clear they're not wanted. On July 19th, 1881, Sitting Bull makes the decision that Crazy Horse made 4 years earlier. He crosses back into the United States and surrenders at Fort Buford, bringing with him the last free band of Plains Indians in North America. The surrender ceremony is as different from Crazy Horse's as possible. Where Crazy Horse was treated as a dangerous prisoner, Sitting Bull is received as a celebrity, a living relic of the Indian Wars whose capture marks their official end. Newspaper correspondents interview him through interpreters. Photographers take his picture. Army officers treat him with the wary respect due a worthy adversary who's finally been defeated. But underneath the ceremony and publicity, the message is the same as it was for Crazy Horse. The old life is over. The resistance is finished. The Plains tribes will live as captives of the reservation system, or they won't live at all. The statistics tell the story more brutally than any narrative ever could. In 1870, there were an estimated 30,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho living the traditional nomadic life on the Great Plains. By 1885, fewer than 15,000 survive on reservations. Their numbers cut in half by warfare, disease, starvation, and despair. The buffalo herds that sustain Plains Indian civilization for centuries are functionally extinct. The great chiefs who led the resistance are dead, exiled, or broken. The warriors who won at Little Bighorn are farming government plots, sending their children to boarding schools, forbidden to speak their own language or practice their own religion. Most tragically of all, the victory that should have vindicated Plains Indian resistance instead becomes the justification for its complete destruction. Little Bighorn proves that the tribes can fight, can win, can defend their homeland against overwhelming odds. But it also proves that they can't win permanently, can't match the industrial capacity and demographic weight of a nation determined to expand coast to coast. The battle that was supposed to end the Indian Wars instead guarantees that they continue until one side achieves total victory. And everyone knows which side has the factories, the railroads, the endless supply of soldiers and settlers. Sitting Bull spends his final years as a prisoner on the Standing Rock Reservation, watched by agents who fear his influence over younger Indians. He's forbidden to travel without permission, forbidden to conduct traditional ceremonies, forbidden to speak publicly about the old days when his people were free. But even in captivity, Sitting Bull remains dangerous to a system that requires Indian leaders to validate white policies. His very existence reminds his people that alternatives once existed, that resistance was once possible, that the old ways don't have to be forgotten just because they've been outlawed. In 1890, that danger becomes too great for the reservation system to tolerate. When Sitting Bull shows interest in the ghost dance, a new religious movement promising the return of the buffalo and the resurrection of the dead, Indian agents decide he's becoming too influential, too threatening to government control. On December 15, 1890, Indian police come to arrest Sitting Bull at his cabin on the Grand River. There's a struggle. Shots are fired, and the last great chief of the Plains tribes dies in the dirt outside his own home, killed by members of his own tribe who are wearing badges and carrying guns, provided by the government he spent his life resisting. The man who united the Plains tribes, who saw the future in visions, who led his people to the greatest victory in their history, dies as a prisoner on land that was once his kingdom. With his death, the last link to the free life is broken. The last voice of traditional authority is silenced. The last hope of cultural survival is extinguished, or so it seems in 1890. As the 19th century draws to a close, and the 20th century prepares to dawn on a continent where manifest destiny appears complete, where the frontier is officially closed, where the Indian Wars are ancient history and the reservations are permanent fixtures of American life. But history has a way of surprising us, and the story of Little Bighorn, like the story of the people who fought there, is far from over. Time does strange things to battles, especially battles that capture the American imagination the way Little Bighorn captured it. What starts as military disaster becomes heroic legend. What begins as shocking defeat transforms into noble sacrifice. What should be remembered as the consequence of arrogance and miscalculation gets reimagined as destiny and martyrdom. By 1890, just 14 years after Custer's defeat, Buffalo Bill Cody is traveling the country with his Wild West show. And guess who's one of his star attractions? Sitting Bull himself, the man who orchestrated the victory, now signing autographs for curious audiences who want to shake hands with the savage who killed their hero. Think about that for a moment. the spiritual leader whose sun dance vision made Little Bighorn possible, the chief who united the Plains tribes in their greatest military triumph, is now a performer in a traveling circus, reenacting his own resistance for the entertainment of the people who destroyed his way of life. But here's what's even stranger. Sitting Bull understands exactly what he's doing. When reporters ask him why he's working for Buffalo Bill, his answer reveals a wisdom that cuts straight through the absurdity of his situation. I am here to show the white people how we lived before they destroyed us. The Wild West show presents a sanitized version of frontier conflict, where brave cowboys and noble cavalrymen fight colorful Indians in staged battles that always end with civilization triumphant. But Sitting Bull's presence adds an element of authenticity that makes audiences uncomfortable. This isn't just theater. This is the real thing. The actual man who planned the actual defeat of George Armstrong Custer. Children who've grown up on dime novels about Indian fighters line up to get Sitting Bull's autograph. Society ladies pose for photographs with the famous Savage. Journalists interview him through interpreters, asking about Little Bighorn, about Custer, about what it felt like to destroy the 7th Cavalry. Sitting Bull plays his role with dignity and a kind of bitter humor. He signs photographs of himself, sells his autograph for 50 cents each, poses for pictures with wide-eyed tourists. But he also uses these opportunities to speak truths that most Americans don't want to hear. When a reporter asks him what he thinks about American civilization, Sitting Bull's response is devastating in its simplicity. The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to distribute it. Meanwhile, back on the reservations, Sitting Bull's people are learning just how much the white man knows about distribution. Government rations are inadequate, frequently contaminated, often delivered months late. Indian agents skim supplies meant for hungry families. Traders charge inflated prices for basic necessities. The reservation system isn't just controlling Native Americans, it's slowly starving them. But something else is happening on those reservations, something that government officials find deeply disturbing. Despite decades of forced assimilation, despite boarding schools that kidnap children and forbid them to speak their native languages, despite laws that outlaw traditional ceremonies and religions, Native American culture isn't dying, it's adapting. In 1889, a northern Paiute prophet named Wovoka receives a vision during a solar eclipse. In that vision, he sees the return of the buffalo, the resurrection of all Native Americans who have died, the restoration of the old life before white contact. Most importantly, he sees a dance, a ceremony that will bring about this transformation through spiritual power rather than military force. The ghost dance, as it comes to be called, spreads across the reservations like wildfire. From tribe to tribe, reservation to reservation, the message travels. Dance the sacred dance, and the old world will return. The buffalo will come back. The dead will rise. The whites will disappear or be transformed into Indians themselves. To desperate people living in poverty on barren reservations, forbidden to practice their traditional religions, watching their children forced into government schools, the ghost dance offers hope. Not the hope of military victory, everyone understands that's impossible now, but the hope of spiritual transformation, of divine intervention, of miraculous restoration. The ceremony itself is unlike anything in traditional Plains Indian religion. Participants join hands in a large circle and dance slowly clockwise, singing special songs that are supposed to bring on trances and visions. Dancers wear special shirts painted with symbols that are said to make them bulletproof. The dance continues for days, with participants falling into trances where they commune with dead relatives and see visions of the restored world. Government officials are terrified by the ghost dance movement, and their terror reveals just how fragile their control over the reservations really is. These aren't war dances. There are no weapons, no battle preparations, no threats of violence. But the ghost dance represents something even more dangerous than military resistance. It represents hope. Hope that the current situation isn't permanent. Hope that Native American culture will survive. Hope that spiritual power can accomplish what military power couldn't. And hope in the hands of oppressed people is always dangerous to their oppressors. At Standing Rock Reservation, Indian agent James McLaughlin watches Sitting Bull's growing interest in the ghost dance with mounting alarm. The old chief hasn't participated in the ceremonies yet, but he's clearly curious about them. And when Sitting Bull gets curious about something, his people pay attention. McLaughlin understands what many government officials don't, that Sitting Bull remains the most influential Native American leader in the country, even in captivity. His word carries weight not just among the Lakota, but among tribes across the West. If Sitting Bull endorses the ghost dance, it could spread to every reservation in America. More dangerously, Sitting Bull's involvement might transform the ghost dance from a peaceful religious movement into something more militant. After all, this is the man who united the Plains tribes for their greatest military victory. If anyone can turn spiritual revival into political resistance, it's Sitting Bull. Through the fall of 1890, McLaughlin sends increasingly frantic reports to Washington about the growing ghost dance movement and Sitting Bull's potential involvement. The old chief hasn't done anything overtly threatening, but his mere presence is destabilizing the reservation system. On December 12, 1890, McLaughlin receives orders from Washington that he's been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Arrest Sitting Bull and remove him from Standing Rock Reservation. The official charge is disturbing the peace, but everyone understands the real reason. The government can no longer tolerate even the possibility of Sitting Bull's continued influence. The job falls to Lieutenant Bullhead, a Lakota policeman who spent years walking the impossible line between his government employers and his traditional people. Bullhead knows Sitting Bull personally, respects him as a leader, understands that arresting him will make him a traitor in the eyes of traditional Lakota. But Bullhead also knows that refusing the order will cost him his job, his salary, his ability to support his own family. It's an impossible situation that perfectly captures the moral complexity of the reservation system, forcing Native Americans to choose between survival and honor, between family loyalty and cultural integrity, between traditional values and economic necessity. On the morning of December 15, 1890, Bullhead leads a force of 43 Lakota policemen to Sitting Bull's cabin on the Grand River. The plan is simple: surround the cabin before dawn. Make the arrest quickly and quietly. Transport Sitting Bull to Fort Yates before his supporters can organize resistance. But nothing about Sitting Bull has ever been simple, and his arrest is no exception. When the police pound on his door at dawn, Sitting Bull doesn't resist. He agrees to come quietly, asks only for time to dress properly for what he knows will be his final public appearance. But as he's being escorted from his cabin, over 100 of his supporters surround the police force. These aren't warriors preparing for battle. They're friends, relatives, people who've lived with Sitting Bull through decades of resistance and defeat. But they're angry, desperate, unwilling to watch their leader dragged away by Indian police working for white authorities. Catch the Bull, one of Sitting Bull's most devoted followers, shouts the words that turn arrest into tragedy. You think you're going to take him? You shall not. The shooting starts immediately. Bullhead fires first, hitting Sitting Bull in the chest. Red Tomahawk, another Lakota policeman, shoots Sitting Bull in the head. Sitting Bull falls dead in the dirt outside his own cabin, killed by members of his own tribe who are wearing badges and carrying guns provided by the government he spent his life resisting. In the gunfight that follows, 7 more men die, policemen and supporters killed in a tragedy that accomplishes nothing except removing the last great symbol of Plains Indian resistance. By the time the shooting stops, Sitting Bull is dead. His supporters are scattered, and the ghost dance movement has lost its most potentially powerful advocate. But killing Sitting Bull doesn't end the ghost dance. it radicalizes it. Across the reservations, the news of his death spreads like grass fire, confirming what many ghost dance believers already suspected. The government will use any excuse to murder traditional leaders, even leaders who aren't actively resisting. At Pine Ridge Reservation, the ghost dance movement reaches crisis proportions. Thousands of Lakota are participating in the ceremonies, and government officials are convinced they're planning an uprising. The situation is so tense that Agent Daniel Royer, nicknamed Young Man, afraid of Indians by the Lakota, calls for military intervention. The army responds by sending units of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, reconstituted after Little Bighorn, to restore order at Pine Ridge. The irony is, perfect and terrible, the same regiment that was destroyed. Defending American expansion is now being used to complete that expansion by crushing the last vestige of Native American spiritual independence. On December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry encounters a band of Minneconjou Lakota, led by Chief Bigfoot, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek. Bigfoot's people aren't warriors. They're refugees fleeing the chaos at Pine Ridge. Families with children and elderly relatives trying to find safety, but the cavalry officers see ghost dance participants, potential hostiles who might be planning resistance. When they order Bigfoot's band to surrender their weapons, the situation explodes into violence that makes Little Bighorn look like a skirmish. The Wounded Knee Massacre, and it is a massacre, not a battle, is the mirror image of Little Bighorn. Where Custer's men died fighting against overwhelming odds, Bigfoot's people die almost without resistance. Where Little Bighorn was a military engagement between armed forces. Wounded Knee is the slaughter of civilians by soldiers equipped with rapid-fire weapons. When the shooting stops, over 300 Lakota are dead, including Bigfoot himself, frozen in the snow with his arm raised, as if still trying to calm the situation. Women, children, elderly people, cut down by Hotchkiss guns and rifle fire, their bodies scattered across the winter landscape like broken dolls. The 7th Cavalry loses 25 men, most of them killed by their own crossfire in the chaos of the massacre. But the Army awards 20 Medals of Honor to soldiers who participated in the slaughter, more than were awarded for any other single engagement in American military history. Wounded Knee marks the official end of the Indian Wars, the final punctuation mark on 3 centuries of conflict between Native Americans and European colonizers. But it's not a victory, it's an atrocity, a war crime, a stain on American history that no amount of myth-making can erase. In the years that follow, America tries to forget about Wounded Knee while celebrating Little Bighorn. Artists paint heroic scenes of Custer's last stand that show him dying nobly while savage hordes swarm around him. Publishers produce countless books about the boy general's sacrifice for civilization. Hollywood makes movies that turn military disaster into patriotic legend. The real story, the story of 2 peoples trapped in impossible circumstances, fighting over resources and worldviews that couldn't coexist, gets buried under layers of mythology that serve everybody's needs except historical truth. Elizabeth Custer, the general's widow, spends the next 57 years of her life carefully crafting her husband's legend. She writes books, gives lectures, lobbies historians and artists to present George as a martyred hero rather than a reckless glory seeker. She outlives almost everyone who knew the real Custer, and by the time she dies in 1933, the mythical version has almost completely replaced the historical one. Meanwhile, the Lakota survivors of Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee are forbidden to tell their own stories. Government policies ban Native American languages, outlaw traditional ceremonies, force children into boarding schools where they're punished for any expression of cultural identity. The voices that could provide alternative perspectives on these events are systematically silenced. For nearly a century, the only version of Little Bighorn that most Americans hear is the one that fits comfortably into national mythology. Brave cavalrymen die heroically defending civilization against savage hordes. Custer becomes a Christ-like figure, sacrificing himself for the greater good. The defeat becomes a victory of spirit over flesh, of idealism over reality. But history has a way of resurging, especially when the people who lived it refuse to let their stories die. In the 1960s, as America grapples with civil rights and questions its own mythologies, Native American voices begin to enter the Little Bighorn narrative for the first time. Descendants of warriors who fought there, elders who heard first-hand accounts from participants, scholars who've preserved oral traditions despite decades of suppression. They start telling different stories. In these versions, Little Bighorn isn't about savage Indians destroying civilized soldiers. It's about people defending their homeland against invasion, about families protecting their children from soldiers who made war on non-combatants, about a last desperate attempt to preserve a way of life that was being systematically destroyed. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield in the 1980s reveal evidence that supports the Native American accounts. The distribution of artifacts, the patterns of bone scattering, the forensic analysis of bullet impacts, all of it tells a story of tactical sophistication rather than savage chaos. The warriors who defeated Custer weren't mindless hordes, they were disciplined fighters using coordinated tactics, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of terrain to achieve decisive victory. Little Bighorn was a military masterpiece, not a lucky massacre. More importantly, the archaeological evidence reveals that the Native American oral histories are remarkably accurate, preserving details about the battle that were lost or distorted in white accounts. For over a century, historians dismissed Native American stories as unreliable folklore. Now it turns out those stories were more accurate than the official military reports. Today, the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument tells a more complete story than the old Custer Battlefield National Monument ever did. Markers honor all who died there, soldiers and warriors, whites and Indians, men who fought for causes they believed in, even when those causes were incompatible. Descendants of both sides meet at the annual commemoration ceremonies, sometimes as former enemies, sometimes as friends, always as Americans trying to understand a shared but complicated history. The grassland where the battle was fought has been restored to something approaching its 1876 condition. Buffalo graze there again, brought back from near extinction by conservation efforts that seem almost miraculous compared to the deliberate slaughter of the 1870s and 80s. But the most important transformation may be the simplest. One, the recognition that this story belongs to all Americans, not just the winners. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who fought at Little Bighorn were defending their families, their culture, their way of life against forces that threatened to destroy everything they valued. The soldiers who died there were serving their country as they understood it, following orders they believed were justified, trying to do their duty in an impossible situation. Both sides were trapped by circumstances larger than themselves, by the inexorable expansion of American industrial civilization, by the collision of incompatible worldviews, by the tragic impossibility of two ways of life coexisting on the same land. Little Bighorn was simultaneously the greatest victory and the greatest defeat in Plains Indian history. A victory because it proved that Native Americans could fight, could win, could defend their homeland against overwhelming odds. A defeat because it guaranteed that those odds would become even more overwhelming, that the response would be so total and so violent that resistance would become impossible. Standing on that battlefield today, looking across the grassland where Custer made his last stand and Crazy Horse won his greatest triumph, you can still feel the weight of that tragedy. The wind still blows across the hills where 263 soldiers died and perhaps 60 warriors joined them. Ravens still circle overhead, just as they did on that hot June afternoon so long ago. But there's something else there now, something that wasn't present in 1876. Understanding. The recognition that this story is more complex than heroes and villains, more nuanced than civilization versus savagery, more human than any mythology can capture. The Little Bighorn story is ultimately about what happens when different peoples, different cultures, different ways of understanding the world collide with such force that compromise becomes impossible and tragedy becomes inevitable. It's about the price of expansion, the cost of resistance, the weight of choices that seem reasonable in the moment but create consequences that echo through generations. George Armstrong Custer rode to Little Bighorn seeking glory and found death. Sitting Bull fought at Little Bighorn defending his people and ultimately watched them disappear into reservations. Crazy Horse won the greatest victory in Plains Indian history and died 4 months after surrendering. The buffalo that sustained Plains Indian civilization for centuries were deliberately exterminated in less than a decade. Everyone lost something at Little Bighorn. The question is what we've learned from their losses and whether we're wise enough to remember their stories, all their stories, as we face our own impossible choices in our own complicated times. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of Little Bighorn. Not that some people are heroes and others are villains, not that some causes are pure and others are evil, but that history is made by human beings, making human choices under impossible circumstances. And that understanding those choices, really understanding them, requires us to listen to all the voices, not just the ones that tell us what we want to hear. The grass grows green now where blood once soaked the earth. The wind carries stories in languages both living and dead. And somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of the last great battle of the American frontier, the day when two worlds collided and both worlds were changed forever.